Cool. So I'm going to kick off everything. My talk tonight is on convention over configuration. Just a little bit of background about myself. My name is Ryan Tablata. I work for a company called Prototypal. We do web development, product development, and JavaScript training. So if you're interested in some product dev or training, we have availability starting in 2018. Or if you just want to chat and hang out, let me know. I'm, I think, at Ryan or R.Tablata on Slack. One of those two should get me. Probably a lot of you know me as that Ember guy on Slack, or if you follow me on Twitter, same thing. So this is a lightning talk. I practiced it last night, and hopefully we're going to get around 15 minutes. But basically, I'm trying to make up for all of the gifs and hot takes that I've not been giving in the last few times that I've talked, because it's been like super technical or super live coding, so there haven't been slides or gifs. So I'm going to make up for that tonight. So my talk is about convention over configuration, and no, this isn't just a sneaky way for me to talk about Ember for 15 minutes. So I wanted to look at what does that term really mean today. So what does this phrase like mean for us as developers, and like what can we learn from it? And to start, we kind of have to look at where did it come from, because some of us may not have been around when that came around, or when it was super popular. So we have this person to blame, which is DHH. The creator of Ruby on Rails. There's probably some other person that he stole it from, but when I went to Wikipedia, it said blame him, so that's what I'm going to go with. In 2005, he created Ruby on Rails. I'm going to turn this down a little bit because I'm loud.
Sorry, I'm humble.
That's okay. So he created Ruby on Rails, which is an opinionated framework in Ruby for getting like database-driven applications developed. He said it was for the 80% application. To give some context, like Spring was groundbreaking-ish at this time. So like you built everything in super, super small chunks. You were writing a lot of custom code for everything, for how your app boots, and basically anything that you wanted to do server-side. There wasn't really like fat client stuff at this point. Like impressive, like progressive web apps and routing and all that kind of stuff didn't exist. So if you're like new to JavaScript, that's pretty new. But 12 years ago, Rails was introduced. And soon after, DHH created a talk, which was a Rails 15-minute blog. He created a blog with blog posts and comments in 15 minutes. I think it had validations, it had HTML forms, it had full CRUD on both resources with relationships. And he did all of this in 15 minutes while describing a new piece of technology that he had just written, which is faster than this talk is going to be. So that's how impressive it was. And it was groundbreaking at the time because web apps are really hard when you think about it. So I've been around the consulting space for a long time. I've built startups. I've worked on training and mentoring people. And I just came up with a little bit of a list of things that you're probably going to have in your app after a few months. You're going to have a database connection. You're going to have configuration for different environments, because you're not just going to have it works on my machine. It's going to work in production and staging and all sorts of different places. Probably that one Windows developer that you contracted to and won't like switch off of Windows 8 because games run good there. You've got cores, and if you're a JavaScript developer, this is hell for you. You have security. You have user authentication, login. Yes, those two things are different and separate. You have token management, which really depends on everything and every decision you've made so far in your application. So hope you get those right. You have an ORM, because you probably don't want to be writing prepared statements or even raw SQL. You want to be able to have database change management or migrations, because you're going to have multiple developers on the application and you're going to make some changes, and you want to reflect that in different environments and not just pass around SQL statements. I've done this. You're going to have rate limiting, because you're going to have that troll that wants to put 2,000 comments on your blog every day, and you want to block him. You're going to want to have file uploads. You're going to want to talk to S3 and file system and uploads. You're probably going to want to abstract this so you don't have to deal with S3 while you're like driving to your parents' house or something. You're going to want to have task and asynchronous behavior, so like something that happens later. You're going to want to have cron jobs because you're going to want to run daily reports and know what happens to your site. You're going to want to have debugging, testing, unit tests, integration tests, mocking because we don't want to test the entire application every time we hit it. You're going to want to have fake factories for fake data, HTTP and end-to-end ways of hooking into your application and knowing what happens. You're going to want to have the ability to set up and tear down your app. You're going to want to have mailing, queuing, serialization, so your data probably shouldn't look just like your database tables. Oh yeah, there's session management, localization, date-time translation, since we just went over daylight savings time, and in case you didn't know it, 4 countries decided last week that, hey, we're not going to do daylight savings time, so hope you got that right. You're going to have encryption, you're going to have password hashing and security. Don't worry, this isn't a problem, it's only like what happened to Equifax. You're going to have caching, so you probably don't want to do the same thing every time a user hits a really expensive resource, so you probably want to cache that in some way. You're going to want to have pagination because after you get in development, tables probably have more than 100 rows. And you're going to want to have other data sources because you know your CEO probably has that friend running a DB2 instance on an IBM 500 somewhere, and yeah, that's actually happened to me. Yeah. By the end of it, you're thinking web apps are hard, and screw this, I'm going to go back to being like a forklift operator. So this is why the Rails 15-minute blog was so cool, because it was like, take all of that away. Just create CRUD apps. Create the things that are meaningful and fast and have good, clean code that you can write and be fast with it. And everyone was like, I want to go to there. But there's some caveats, because let's look at what Rails 1.0 was when DHH introduced it. At the time, it really only supported MySQL. You could kind of get it to connect to like Postgres and SQL Server, and I don't even remember if SQLite existed in 2005, but basically, if you didn't use MySQL, half of the relationship and join table stuff in Rails just didn't work. You pretty much were locked into using active model unless you wanted to write your SQL statements as strings, because there wasn't really a prepared statement wrapper, and that was all coupled into active model. Controllers pretty much always either redirected or returned a view. There weren't really other things that you could do from them. Config was set up for only 3 environments: production, testing, and development. So if you wanted to have stage or that Windows person's weird box, good luck. Config was pretty much limited to just configuring your database connection, and that's about it. Templates at the time, you had to use RHTML, and if you're wondering what the heck RHTML is, there's a reason. No one uses it. And you're probably thinking now, well, that's a bummer. And if you've not used Rails, but have just kind of heard of Rails and have been like, oh, Rails is so like convention driven and I have to buy into everything, you're probably thinking like changing any decision that was going on there was like digging out the foundation of your house and then like building this Frankenstein house with like pieces that aren't right, and you just have like random Ruby code running inside of your Rails app, and trying to use third-party libraries at the time was a mess. But let's fast forward to 2015 and beyond. I just said 2015 because that's when Back to the Future 2 went to. Rails still has this motto of quote-unquote convention over configuration. But let's look at what running a Rails app is today. Well, when you run Rails new, you actually get a bunch of different options. Do you want an API-only server that has no HTML or no asset pipeline or no management for that? There's no like flashing variables and all of the cruft that goes along with printing out HTML from your backend. It just takes all of that out. With a flag to Rails new, you can decide if you are using HTML, if you want your assets to be compiled using Ruby or Webpack. I think there used to be a grunt option too, but they got rid of that. Databases. You want to talk to pretty much any type of SQL? Go for it. I think there's even IBM DB2 drivers if you really want to go with the legacy route. There's tons of plugins and add-ons that just work. You gem install something and maybe run one other like rake command, and it's set up for you. Cores literally takes me 2 lines of code. I uncomment 2 of them, hit bundle install, and I've got cores in my entire application. I don't have to remember, oh, where's that express route that I really want to expose and do all this stuff. Sure, it's global. There's ways to configure it more and locally do it, but pretty much it just works for the 99% use case that you want it to work for. So you can gem install your way up to an application, and there's even first and second party add-ons that like plug in, work. You can get, I think there's even flags to add these when you Rails new. You can have mail, caching, authentication, and more. Why did I do 2 periods instead of 3? And really, this is behind Rails' new motto, which isn't as snappy as convention over configuration. But if you go to Rails, rubyonrails.org or .com or whatever, they say Rails is about learning to build a modern web app, because learning to build a web application is daunting. Ruby on Rails makes it easier and more fun. It includes everything you need to build fantastic applications, and you can learn with it with the support of our large friendly community. It's a building block, it's a base house that you can go on top of, and then really, I forgot to change these 2 slides. It makes it so that like changing a decision, changing from ERB to handlebars or HAML, if you don't like opening and ending tags, is more like changing a window or changing like a piece of your existing house, rather than having to like dig out a new foundation and rebuild from scratch. So there's this idea of convention over configuration, and I think that really matched the idea of what Rails 1 was, where you're going to go our way or you're alone, right? If you want to change a decision from what we have, sorry, too bad. There's no real way to add on to this system or plug into this system. It's just what it is. And I think that served a purpose at the time, because we were having fatigue of building small little pieces up into a big application for what was essentially the same thing over and over again. But when we look at tools like Rails, and I'm going to mention a few in JavaScript in a second, it's not so much convention as customization. We start with something that's good, and then we can drop in little pieces, and everything else stays the same. When I put in one new window, I don't have to change my entire living room. So now we get to, Ryan, this is not Nash Ruby or Nash RB. This is a JavaScript thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the state of this is in Node and JavaScript, because I think there was a conversation that I had in the JavaScript channel where I'm like, I don't know that there's going to be like a Ruby-like framework that'll ever emerge on the back end in Node. I feel that in Node, a lot of the frameworks hit either the convention or the configuration. So on the convention side, you have things like Sales.js and Feathers, where it's like, here, it just works. And if you want to do anything other than the CRUD that we have, it's up to you. Like you have to dig into kind of internals and weird configuration points in the application to get out of what we want you to do. And then on the configuration side, there's Rails, or at the extreme, Koa, which like doesn't even have get and put and like URL routing. You have to build from Koa and then add Koa router and then add Koa router cores and then add Koa router DB framework thing, majigger, blah, and how do you organize all these files? And it's like every decision is left up to you, and then it doesn't work with half the Node packages because all the Node packages are built on top of Connect, and Koa like doesn't care about what Connect did until you have like the Koa Connect thing that like replaces the APIs, and it's like all of these things become really weird and funky, and you have to make every decision along the way, and if one thing updates and breaks 12 other pieces, good luck. What we're missing is that middle ground of like, it's a good starting point, and it tries to give you good hooks and learn from where Rails is today instead of learning and trying to be that Rails 1.0. I think that there are some things, I've talked about Adonis before, it's getting close. It needs like it needs some love. And then there's also Denali.js, which is, I think, going to be cool eventually. Probably noticing that I'm also leaving out front end, and I do mostly front end development. So let's talk about npm run eject. Sorry, Russ. Who's used create React app? Yeah. Who's tried to do like Sass or used a different testing framework or used server-side rendering or added styles in JS? Yeah. What do you have to do? You have to run npm run eject. And the problem is you go from like, create React app is actually a really cool like convention over configuration idea of like, we give you everything and we've made decisions for you and like tough beans if you don't like some of the decisions we've made or all of the decisions we've made. And then you say npm run eject and you're thrown all the way to the other side of things. You have this webpack config which is confusing and all the way down to like as low level as you can get. And what's even worse is you didn't build it for your app. It's built for a convention-driven but still fairly wide audience, and you probably don't understand it, and 2 days after you run npm run eject, it's probably out of date too. So I'm going to compare that real quick, and sorry, here's the other thing. I am going to say Ember. Big surprise. But I'm going to compare it to the Ember and Angular CLI experiences. So like, if I have an existing or new Ember application with no weird stuff to it, I can just say Ember install Ember web app, and now I have manifest.json and service worker installed. So I know I've seen in the JavaScript Slack and stuff like, hey, I used this server-side rendering loader in Webpack, and now it broke my manifest.json for some reason, because that makes sense. You want to add server-side rendering. Ember install Ember fastboot. I think Angular CLIs, I don't know what they call their server-side rendering, but it's pretty much works on any Ember or Angular CLI application. Just boots, creates an express app for you. You want to have like deploy to S3. Ember install Ember CLI deploy deploy S3, and now you can put in your S3 credentials or have them as env variables, and it like will just shoot it into a bucket for you. No extra hassle, no extra things. There are configuration loops if you don't want to do things. So if you don't want to use, for instance, like Ember data, because it's confusing and complex and you've been using Redux for years, don't use it. Take it out. Remove it from your package.json and just go. There are some things like handlebars in Ember. If you want to learn more about that, come see my talk at November. But so there are some conventions that you can't break out of, but those are more like bumpers. There's a lot of room that you have to play with. So I think we can start learning from like what has gone well in the Rails and Laravel and Django communities, where it's like, here's a good starting out point. There's a lot of hooks for you to customize the parts where you want to be able to customize. But instead of like saying, I'm going to build all the way from the ground up, let's start looking at ways that we can say, I only really want to change like those two things. So why don't I use what's built and then go from there?